you so much for joining us. I know that people are still joining in, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Emmy Betts, and I'm so excited to be co-hosting this webinar. I'm an emergency physician and a researcher at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, where I direct the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative. The initiative is a venture through the Department of Emergency Medicine and the Injury and Violence Prevention Center. Our initiative seeks to coordinate, synergize, and stimulate collaborative approaches to firearm injury prevention. And today's event is really intended to be a how-to for how we can better talk and work with each other. The initiative has core values that I'd like to share because I think they also can be ground rules for today. The first is recognition of a common goal of health and security. The second is a respect for diversity and consideration of a range of views. And the third is engagement of affected communities and those with lived experience. So we come here today to listen to and to learn from each other, and with the recognition that words matter. Today, we're going to have a brief presentation from each of our speakers, followed by a moderated question and answer session. Please put your questions into the Q&A box because we'd love to try to get to the questions that you have. But to start, I'd like to turn it over to my co-host, Megan Rainey, who's an emergency physician and researcher at Brown. And she's also one of the co-founders and now chief research officer for Affirm. Megan.
Thank you, Emmy. It's an absolute delight to be here with all of you today, virtually as always right now. I'm really excited to talk a little bit today with our esteemed panelists about the ways that we can talk about firearm injury in ways to move the conversation forwards. So I'm going to start actually by sharing my screen. If I can, the joy of Zoom, as we see the numbers, this is all right. So I'm going to start by kind of putting us all on the same page. As a good academician, I'm going to start with some disclosures, which is that I do have research support. I serve as a couple of volunteer positions for nonprofits, and I do have a small amount of funding from Medscape that my university requires that I disclose. And if my screen will change, there we go. So I want to start by getting us all kind of on the same page. I think a lot of times when we talk about firearm injury, we all come to it with our preconceptions, the facts that we may have heard or read, and the differences between the facts that we start the conversation with make it difficult to ever come to a point of coherence and shared objectives. So my goal over the next few minutes is going to be to just kind of take us through a few shared facts around the current truth that we know around just the numbers around firearm injuries and deaths in this country. So the facts are that across the United States, approximately 100 people are killed and 200 are injured every day by firearms. 2/3 of those deaths are suicides. The rates of firearm injury and death have been increasing. This, for those who are not researchers, this is rate per 100,000. So this adjusts for population. So it accounts for the fact that there are more people. I'm not just presenting raw numbers here, but you can see that the rate of suicide by gun and the rate of homicide by gun has been increasing since about the mid 2010s. And it's been a pretty substantial increase. Another important shared fact for us to know is that despite kind of what we read in the media, firearm injury and death is experienced in every state across the United States. And the rates are actually highest in some of our more rural states. So this is often perceived as being an urban problem, and it's not. Our highest rates are seen in states like Alaska, Montana, Missouri, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And another shared fact that I think is worth saying out loud, and I know is going to be reflected by our panelists, is that most of us in the United States know someone affected by gun violence. Certainly as a physician, I have taken care of innumerable victims of firearm injury, but our military, our first responders, our rural, our school kids, we all know someone, even if we don't sometimes know that we do, because there's often a stigma around talking about it. To delve a little more deeply into the epidemiology or the stats around firearm injury, this graph along the bottom, along the x-axis, we see age in years, And along the y-axis are going up and down, we see absolute numbers of firearm deaths in the United States in 2018, which is the last year that we have reliable data available at this point. The 2019 data has not been released yet. You can see that there's a big spike in firearm injuries in the late teens and early 20s, and then firearm injuries really plateau, at least among men, up through late middle age, and then decrease. Rates for women, or absolute numbers of firearm injuries for women, we see again that rates increase, or numbers of deaths increase in the late teens and early 20s, and then really stay stable across the life. I'll say for women, most of our firearm deaths are through domestic violence homicide. But for men, I'm going to delve a little more deeply into why men die from firearm injury and really who is dying as well. When you look at the race and ethnicity of male deaths from firearm injury, you see a slightly different pattern from the prior slide, which was all men. Here, this looks first at non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, and then the black, excuse me, for the formatting issue is Hispanic men. And you can see that there's almost two peaks here, right? So there's, again, this peak in the young adult years and then another peak in the middle-aged years. And there's, in some ways, it almost seems like there's two different patterns of firearm death happening, right? And we'll talk about that over the course of this presentation. But the deaths in the young adult years, whether for whites, blacks, or Hispanics, is largely homicide. The middle-aged and further years are largely around suicide. And one of the things to note here is that these are, again, absolute numbers. So there is a disproportionate impact of firearm homicide on our young minority men. But overall, in terms of absolute numbers of firearm deaths across the country, 2/3 of firearm deaths year by year are experienced by non-Hispanic whites. So finally, a last set of shared facts is about why people are dying. I've already alluded to this. In 2018, there were around 40,000 deaths from firearms. About 1% of them were accidental or unintentional. Things like a kid finding a firearm in their parents' nightstand, or somebody having a hunting accident. They're still preventable, even if we call them accidents. Only about 0.3% are mass shootings. Around 35 to 40% are homicides and legal interventions, which are grouped together. And as I've already mentioned, about 2/3 are suicide deaths, which is an important shared fact for us as we start this conversation. I include this slide to acknowledge injuries and also to point out the shared fact that although those mass shootings, which are the bright greens on this graph, are the public mass shootings are the things that many of us are most scared of, they are the minority of injuries even for our kids in the United States. And firearm injury is the second leading cause of death for children in the United States. Finally, I want to acknowledge that talking about firearm injury and death has to acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of firearms out in circulation in the United States. There are approximately 330 million firearms that we know of, which are in private hands. That's not counting ones that are not manufactured, but are rather made at home. We know that there are kind of things like ghost guns and other ways to create your own firearm. But there are only about 40,000 firearm deaths. Now that's 40,000 too many, but the point of this slide is to start us out with a shared fact, which is that most firearms are not used to hurt or kill someone. And part of the point of our talk here is also the underlying point behind Affirm Research, which is, as Emmy mentioned, the nonprofit that I'm honored to get to volunteer with, which is moving the discussion about firearm injury into a realm of facts, where we talk about there being this problem, which is firearm injury and death, which is sustained by folks with certain risk factors. And I didn't talk about those in the prior talk or prior few minutes, but that also provides us with a possibility for a solution, which gets outside of this kind of tired old debate between policy and politics and moves us into a realm of where we can come together to try to form real solutions to this very real problem affecting the United States. With that, I am going to introduce our three esteemed panelists.
Megan, can I jump in really quickly? I have a couple more
please.
things to say before you introduce
go
our
for it, Emma.
speakers. That's okay. Sorry, back and forth. We did want to just acknowledge a few other things before we jump into the conversation, because I think as Megan said, I think we have to come to this with an understanding of some shared facts around who is dying and the proximate numbers of guns that are out there. But I think also the shared fact that we all want our families and friends to be safe, and nobody wants to lose a loved one. We are really excited today that we have a very diverse audience who is joining us, which is wonderful. It includes public health professionals, clinicians, firearm instructors, many other from the public. And we hope that this conversation will be useful no matter the context that you are coming from. I think, we're hoping today's conversation will cover all kinds of things. So for example, for me, it's come up in when my child is going over for a play date at a kid's house. How do I politely and in a friendly way ask about guns in the home? If I'm caring for a patient who's been shot, how do I get the information that we need to provide care, like when the shooting happened, but without the patient feeling interrogated? And if I'm worried about a friend who I think is at risk of suicide, what's the best way to convince them to take some steps to make their home safer while they're getting better and lock up guns? And so that's where this webinar today came from, is really understanding that the words that we use matter. I have stumbled often, even in our planning call, I made some mistakes. So, so I want to emphasize that we're here today in the spirit of learning and listening, and there are no dumb questions. But we also really wanted to explicitly acknowledge the tensions and stresses of 2020 and 2021 so far. There's no way for our session today to adequately explore or debrief the important topics of racism, policing, political tensions, the 2020 spike in gun sales, the violence in Washington. We are not trying to ignore it, but I just want to acknowledge for the audience up front and for our panelists that that's not going to be our focus today. So if you put questions in and we don't get to them, that's part of the reason, is we think those topics deserve really their own forum. So with that, now, Megan, I would love it if you could introduce our guests and we can get going.
Thank you, Emmy. Thank you for that really thoughtful introduction and kind of added commentary. So with that, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our three panelists and turn it over to them. We're going to start with Dr. Jill Harkavy-Friedman, who is a Vice President of Research at the American Foundation for Suicide Research. Dr. Jill leads the AFSP's growing research grant program, working with over 200 scientific advisors to both evaluate progress in the field and chart the next areas of inquiry to yield impactful insights and strategies for suicide prevention. I've gotten to know her over the past 3 years, partly through her leadership in the realm of firearm suicide prevention. AFSP was one of the early organizations to talk thoughtfully and persistently about this issue before others did. So I'm really excited to have her on the panel today. Second, Rob Pincus, who is a national leader in the firearm industry. He's worked as a law enforcement officer, graduated from Norwich University, which is a military university, in 1994, and was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army Reserve. He's the executive vice president of the Second Amendment organization, which is focused on grassroots advocacy to protect gun rights and responsible gun ownership, and is executive director of the Personal Defense Network, a distance education company with a worldwide network of instructors covering all aspects of personal safety and defense. Finally, and this is the way that Emmy and I have gotten to know him, is that he's a board member of Walk the Talk America, which is a nonprofit working to end the stigma that gun owners generally have around mental health, and to educate the gun community, or excuse me, to educate mental health professionals about the gun community. And so we're just so honored to have him here today to join us as well. Last but not least, Fatimah Dreyer, who I used to know as Fatimah Mohammed, who is the executive director of the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention, or the HAVI, which is a national network of hospital-based violence intervention programs that serve violently injured patients by addressing the social determinants of health. In our couple of minutes before the call, she let me know that they're actually in 85 cities now across the United States. And they work to expand health-based trauma-informed care by cultivating their alliance of docs, researchers, violence prevention professionals, and most of all, communities. I think that one of the things that you'll hear from all three of our speakers is that importance of listening to the community and respecting the community that you work with, no matter which community it is. So without further ado, Jill, I'm going to turn this over to you. And I will say one final thing, which is that we all agreed before we started this that we're going to refer to each other by first names. So just that the folks on the call know, I'm a big fan of calling people Mr., Dr., Ms., but for the purpose for this one, we're using first names. So Jill, go ahead.
Okay, and the other agreement was very short presentations. So I'm going to start with mine. So I'm going to work on sharing my screen. But while I do that, I want to reiterate what what Megan said, which is that almost 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides, which is important to realize because people don't get that that's the biggest problem in gun deaths. For certain populations, as she also showed. But the other point to think about is that 50% of suicides are by firearms. And so in the area of suicide prevention, firearms, guns play a big role. And we've learned through research that when you can limit access to lethal means of any kind, and I'm going to talk more about that, then you can reduce the risk of suicide and actual death by any kind of means. So just American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Our mission is to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. And you're welcome to visit our website, afsp.org. But what I want to say is that one of the missions that we've taken up, and we've already learned so much and need to learn more, is in the area of firearm ownership. And another point I want to make is that the majority of suicides by firearms are with somebody else's gun. There's nothing unique about the firearm owning community. There's not more mental health problems. There's not anything. It's not about the people who own the guns. It's about accessibility to guns. That's our biggest issue. So we're here today to talk about how do we reach people? How do we talk to people? And that the language that we use really makes a difference. And so I just want to say a couple of words about how we talk about suicide. So first of all, things have changed. In the olden days when nobody understood suicide, which is not that long ago, unfortunately, it wasn't until the mid-70s that anybody even realized the brain is involved in suicide. So it was always thought to be, just a bad person, and it was a decision and all this. But now we've come to realize that the brain is involved in suicide, that thinking has changed when someone is in a suicidal crisis. And the bottom line is this is a person and a family and a community that's affected by suicide. So we no longer say committed by suicide, because that committed, if you're a family member and you've lost someone to suicide, it sounds like they committed a crime. And it's not criminal behavior. Suicide is the result of health conditions, and often more than one health condition. So like any other health condition, we say died by suicide or ended his or her life or killed themselves. Because you wouldn't say that somebody committed a heart attack or committed diabetes or committed kidney failure. You acknowledge that it was a health condition, just like suicide is. So we just say died by suicide is preferred, but if you need some flexibility, there are some other options. The other thing is we don't rate people and judge people's suicidal behavior. And the terminology that you probably heard is a failed attempt or a successful attempt. Now, reason why we don't say that is because it doesn't make any sense. Are we saying that when a person is successful, they're dead, but if they failed, they're still alive? That makes no sense. And so you make a suicide attempt. It's not like a diving competition where you get a number about how well you did your suicidal behavior. You made a suicide attempt or you died by suicide. You're going to slip. You're going to say committed even after we're having this little conversation. And just if it starts with awareness that you're saying that, and then it moves into saying died by suicide or suicide attempt, then we've made some progress. And the people who've been affected by suicide really appreciate it. The second thing that's so important when we talk about suicide is that there's never one single cause for suicide. And I'm saying that's language because we often say, oh, they killed themselves because they broke up their relationship or because they lost their job or because whatever. And I'm going to show you how we think suicide works. But it's not that event, because if you think of any of those events, many of us, if we think back, have broken up relationships. Many of us have lost jobs. We've been through all kinds of life events, and we haven't taken our lives. But what happens with the person who's at risk for suicide is that there are certain factors that contribute to suicide. Each person's contributors may differ, but we know that there are biological, psychological, social, and environmental factors. And we all have them, just like we all have mental health. If you think you don't have mental health, think again. We all have mental health. And so it's these factors in the background that are working. And sometimes in the context of life events, they might converge in a way that increases the risk for suicide. Some people may have strong risk factors, but never even think about suicide. Some people have fewer factors, but in the right context or the wrong context, they might end up in a suicidal place. But the one thing we know is that a person cannot die by suicide without lethal means. And so that's part of why, as I said, half of suicide deaths are with guns. We have to learn how to talk to each other about guns in a non-judgmental way, in a health promoting way to save lives. There's great studies. There's a study with the Israeli military where there are high rates of suicide. And so what they did is, you may not know, but in Israel, everybody carries their gun around with them all the time. Well, what they did is they asked people to leave their guns on the base on the weekends. And then they can get them again when they get back to the base. And guess what? They reduced the rate of suicide 40%. It's not that more suicides happened during the week. It's probably that more people had precipitants and contributors like alcohol, things like that, that increased the likelihood of them taking their lives. So they literally reduced the rate 40%. So I just want to say we all play a role in suicide prevention, how we talk about it, how we talk to each other in the broader community, because let's face it, we've all been touched by suicide, whether you know someone who died by suicide or thinking about suicide or has engaged in suicidal behavior. It's a sad but true fact that most of us have been touched by suicide, and we can do something to change that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill. I always enjoy listening to you and learn something every single time. So thank you. With that, Rob, I know you have a few slides to share as well.
There we go. Yeah, so Emmy's going to handle my technical support there. Again, I'm really honored to be here today, and by no means do I speak, obviously, for every gun owner. It's sort of what this first slide is about, because we are an incredibly diverse community. But I do speak, I think, for a lot of gun owners, and I'm familiar with a lot of different gun owners. I've been in the gun community, as long as I can remember. I've been shooting since I was a kid. My father was a law enforcement officer when I was born, so there were guns in the house, there were firearms around, and obviously I've worked in the firearms community for 25 years now, full-time, 20 years as an educator. And one of the most important things to understand is this diversity, so that when we talk about gun owners, and I do a lot of work through Walk the Talk America with mental health professionals, therapists, people who want to help people in crisis, maybe acute crisis, to avoid having ended their own life with a suicide. And understanding that diversity and accepting that anyone you're talking to could be a firearms owner for any variety of reasons, I think is a good place to start. So this first slide, merely simply states that the gun community is diverse. If we think about who owns guns in the U.S., I get it. Most of the people that own guns, most people who are likely to be seen at the gun range or the gun shop are going to look more like me. They're going to look like the middle-aged white guy. But every race, every gender, every faith, every lifestyle, economic bracket, every region of the country, urban and suburban, rural, remote, mountaintop, wherever you are, there's going to be firearms. And I think that image that we have, the cliche that we have of certain people owning firearms, or maybe only certain types of people owning firearms in certain environments. There are cliches about who owns guns in the cities versus who owns guns on the mountain. Colorado. And what I find inside of the gun community is more and more those cliches break down. They fall apart in the face of the fact. Now, I do have wide span ages with a little asterisk there, because obviously there are laws and restrictions on children owning guns. But in my family and in many families across the country, many people give a gift of a firearm, or there may be a firearm that a father will buy for his son, week he's born, the week before he's born, and that obviously stays in a safe or stays disassembled in a closet or something until the child is old enough to take possession of it. But growing up in New Jersey, I had firearms that I had my own access to, of my own key to the safe. Legalities aside, I think the statute of limitations has passed, but I'm in a very firearms safe family and a firearms safe environment. When I was a teenager, I had access to my own gun. So there's a little asterisk on the wide span of ages, depending on where you are and you know what type of family kids are living in. They may have access to firearms as well, supervised or unsupervised. We look at that next area. What types of guns do people own? There's a lot of concern, I think, when I deal with people who aren't inside of the firearms community about talking about the types of guns. And of course, the big buzzword is assault weapons, right? That's the one we want to avoid. Notice that we don't have assault weapons down here because the assault weapon is a very specific type of firearm. It's become a very, toxic, if I can use that word, buzzword that gets used in the media. Sometimes it gets used, by anti-gunners or those people who are pro-gun control to create a more nefarious image of a firearm. The fact is that we go with rifles, pistols, and shotguns. There are technically other derivatives. There are technically, obviously, subdivisions within all of those areas. But rifles, pistols, and shotguns are going to be the easiest way to talk about them. A pistol, I have one right here, being a handheld gun that can be carried conveniently, used for defense. Police officers carry them. They're used for sport, hunting, recreation, obviously collecting, all the things that we look over here. Why do people own guns? Rifles are designed to be touched up against the body. You put your head down on the rifle, generally 2 arms to shoot, much larger. They can be more powerful, but they can also shoot literally the least powerful common ammunition available. So just because something's a rifle doesn't necessarily mean it's more powerful than a pistol. Some pistols shoot rifle ammunition and vice versa. And then shotguns. And shotguns are used, we think of them primarily for hunting or for sport, but they're also used for home defense. Infamously, our President-elect Joe Biden at one point suggested that possibly to defend your home and your family, you would go outside with a shotgun and fire rounds into the air. In the firearms community, we do not recommend that because those rounds are going to come down somewhere, and it's something we don't want to have happen in the wrong place. So when we're going to use a shotgun for defense, just like a rifle or a pistol, people have this idea that shot just spreads very, very quickly. The reality is inside of a home, a hallway, around a house, around a police officer's car, the shot pattern stays very, very compact. So again, we go over why do people own guns. I've mentioned defense a couple of times. Defensive tools, that is the primary reason that people have been buying guns. Obviously last year, whether it was civil unrest or the pandemic or any number of other reasons, obviously there's political motivations inside of the firearms community for people to feel like they might need to go out and get the guns while they can, with the incoming administration having a very anti-gun mindset. But ultimately, the vast majority of those guns are being bought as defensive tools. There's recreational shooting, competition, collecting. I put all of those together because that's all essentially fun with guns. And a lot of people do have fun with guns. And then again, when we talk to the mental health community, it's really important to understand that for some people, that is the recreation. That is the hobby. That is the way you hang out with your friends. It's the thing that you do with your family. It is, in a very positive way, therapeutic, even though someone from outside of the gun community might see it as, well, you're using a weapon. It could be a weapon, but it's also a recreational tool in the same way that you might have a bow and arrow. It could be archery for fun, recreation, competition, sport, or it was a tool of war at one time in our species. And then also we have competitions in hunting, things like that happen with bows and arrows today. You see I have hunting here. Hunting gets a lot of talk from outside of the gun community, I think. A lot of people identify with the idea of hunting, the sporting traditions. Obviously, in some parts of rural America, people still do sustenance hunt. They actually put meat into their freezers and onto their families' tables. They count on that meat for protein and for sustenance. It's not the vast majority of gun owners at all. It's something we give a nod to, we accept, we acknowledge. But there was a fascinating set of statistics that came out a few years ago on advertising inside of the gun community, inside of firearms, in the records of firearms magazines that have been around for a long time. It used to be upwards of 80 or 90% in many of the major publications. The advertising was based on hunting or recreational use. We now see that to be very, very little of the advertising, and the vast majority of the advertising, because the vast majority of the consumer activity is in the defensive area. And it's important to remember also that armed professionals, right? And again, this gets us back to who owns guns in the US, just like every gender, race, faith, lifestyle is involved in the law enforcement and military communities. Well, they all have firearms as well. So we have armed security, we have firearms instructors, people who work at ranges, right? So we have plenty of people who own firearms just for work. They may not be firearms enthusiasts, they may not be active members of the gun community, but they still have the firearms, and their family therefore still has firearms home. So we need to remember that group. And then I put estates in here because there are many times I'll be at a dinner party or an event. Somebody finds out I'm the gun guy, and somebody comes over to say, you know, I've got a gun in the closet, or we've got a gun in the attic, or my uncle passed away and he left me his hunting rifle or his shotgun, and we don't even really know what to do with it. There are a lot of guns out there in the private sector, in private hands, with people who are uneducated about firearms use, or maybe even firearms storage and the firearms laws, because they inherited them or they were given them by family members. So that's an issue we have to be aware of as well. And then what do people do with guns? I've probably hit all of these things along the way. You can read that for yourself, and we'll jump pretty quickly to the next slide because this is going a little longer than I thought it was going to go, and talk about the culture of firearms. And just again, understanding that there are many nuances here inside of the firearms culture. But I did want to put up some behaviors and beliefs that I think are a really good place to start in terms of thinking about how to talk with gun owners if you're not a gun owner. Firearms owners generally have a very strong belief in individual rights. And I always try to go very quickly with the next line. Individual responsibility is a big part of that. And that's not just the sort of the obligation of the responsible ownership, which we put on a lot of people as Second Amendment organization, that we really stress with new gun owners. For example, the number one rule is control access from people who shouldn't have access to the gun. And if you're a new gun owner and you haven't taken a class, you haven't been educated how to use it, you're included in that group. So, keep it in the safe, keep it unloaded, keep it disassembled until you can get educated. That's the obligation of personal responsibility or individual responsibility. Many, many people take to a firearm, they buy the firearm, they obtain the firearm, as we saw last year, because they feel a responsibility, they perceive a responsibility that exists that drives them to the firearm. So they're taking advantage of an individual right protected by the Second Amendment in the US, and that's the next line. The acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the current interpretation under federal law and under federal courts of the individual right to keep and bear arms. That right exists, but it really is the responsibility. It's not the right for its own sake, but it's legitimacy of the Second Amendment, it's protections of that right that allows firearms owners to meet what they perceive as their responsibility to be prepared to defend themselves. And that'll take us over to the behaviors. And these are the behaviors that sometimes do get in the way, honestly, I'll say from my perspective inside of our community, that sometimes get in the way of best practices or the best examples we could give of responsible firearms ownership, especially when it comes to suicide prevention and sort of self-care. Controlling your environment. So many times at Walk Talk America, we'll tell people, hey, we've got these quick access safes. I can't see my screen. I'll show you in a minute. Quick access safes, which are very easy to get into, very reliable. There's a lot of different types out there, a lot of different brands all across different price ranges. And if you have kids in your house and you want to have a firearm prepared, right? That's our next one, is prepare. We can go ahead and throw up all three of those words there. Prepare and defense. So if you want to be prepared to defend yourself, going back to your perception of responsibility, you're going to take advantage of your rights. You're going to get the training. You're going to get the education. You also want to be able to control access to your firearm. And the idea that someone is going to tell you, potentially perceived as a violation of your rights, that you must lock the gun up, well, that is perceived as an infringement. That goes against the concept that exists inside of the Second Amendment of how we are allowed to be told what to do with our firearms and how we access them, how we store them, what we do with them by the government. And if we come in and say, well, you should keep your gun locked up, to me, that's self-evident. And I would hope it's self-evident to 99.99% of firearms owners. But if I say it, as opposed to a mental health professional, a medical professional, an elected official that says you should lock your firearm up, what sometimes you will get in the mind of the gun owner, the gun culture, is a lack of control. You don't have someone giving you sound advice. You have someone telling you what you must do. So there's a subtle nuance between the should and could, right? So can you keep your gun unlocked? Sure. Should you? No. And that's the difference between these legal issues and responsible issues. So one of the things we talked about in the prep call was some of the touch words that are I have mentioned assault weapon. Another one is gun safety or firearm safety, right? If your version of gun safety is, well, you'd be safer if you didn't have a gun in the house, I get it, right? If there's less chance of a child in a single family home drowning if there isn't a pool in the backyard, right? But we put the pool in the backyard, we increase the likelihood of drowning. You buy a big dog, there's an increased chance someone in that house is going to get bit by a dog. You put a gun in the house, there's an increased chance someone can get hurt in a situation that involves the gun. But safety inside of the gun community can never mean, well, just get rid of the gun and you're safer. It has to mean the responsible way in which we interact with the gun. Emmy made a comment earlier about accident. We use the word negligence. We say, well, we call it an accident, but if it was preventable, then somewhere along the line, someone has to take accountability for that. And we refer to that as firearms negligence that led to that injury or death. And again, that comes back to responsibility. It comes back to exercising our rights in an appropriate way. And we can stop the screen share here at this point. And the last one I want to talk about, I think, was very early in the presentation, and by no means is this any kind of an attack, Jill, on you or anyone else, but even gun violence. Even when we say gun violence, there's this idea that the gun doesn't do anything. The gun isn't inherently violent. So there's violence that involves firearms or firearms involved violence, right? And just being a little more sensitive to that presentation can set a gun owner up to be much more ready to hear you. The numbers that people throw around, there's a lot of different versions of the numbers. One of the things I mentioned, and I appreciate it being acknowledged just a few moments ago, the idea that there's 330 million-ish guns in the country, right? At that time, from that source. Well, one of the things that we have are private transfers. Privately, we have 3D printed guns now. We have manufactured guns or manufactured gun parts that the owner can complete that there's literally no record of anywhere. By federal law, there's not a federal registry of firearms or firearms owners. So we know that there are hundreds of millions of guns in this country. The vast majority of them aren't involved in any kind of negative outcome. That's one of the things we like to say is there's these negative outcomes. So rather than just gun violence, it's a negative outcome involving a gun, or violence involving a gun, or a death involving a gun. And then we're going to talk about why or how from there. So those are some of the things that I think are important to understand. Is we talk about responsibility, not safety. We talk about responsible gun ownership, not necessarily legal gun ownership. And we talk about negative outcomes as opposed to gun violence more than anything else.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very, very much. And that is a beautiful transition into Fatimah's discussion. So I'm going to let you talk, Fatimah, for a little bit here. And
wonderful.
Actually, real quick before I turn it over to you, I say I'm going to let you talk. And I'm going to say, I know Emmy and I are keeping an eye on the chat. We are seeing all of your terrific comments and questions. We are not going to have time to get to all of them. We promise that we will have more. So we're going to do our best. We will provide resources at the end for questions that we don't get a chance to answer to. And for those that seem like recurring questions, we'll find ways to talk about them. So go ahead, Fatimah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you again. I am learning so much from this myself. It's a really powerful discussion. Again, Fatimah Loren Dreyer from the Health Alliance for Violence Intervention. And I do want to get to questions, so I'm going to do my best to drive through this. So Megan opened with a lot of kind of the prevalence of violence in this country, and really naming that here that African Americans, it's one of the, violence, death by firearm, right? It's one of the leading causes of death for young people largely, and that's something to note, right? There's a disproportionate impact in communities of color, and in particular, there's a phenomenon of repeat violent injury. So there are non-fatal shootings. There's again disproportionately impacting boys and men of color largely, and there are a number of studies that look at some of the re-injury rates that we see, and some of our work at the Javi is supporting hospital-based violence intervention programs, which, I won't spend tons of time talking about the model. What I'll share here is this real focus on how you can connect the person who might be caught in cycles of violence, may have increased risk for violence, connecting them to services post-discharge, right? They're coming to the hospital. There is a time that you have, and I really appreciate what Rob said about the power of credibility, that it's about not only hospital staff, but aligning with community people who may have lived experience, may have themselves been connected in some ways to the experience of violence, either as a victim of violence or what have you, that the credibility of having, peer advocates or community health workers as part of a team, connecting to those who are victims of violence and connecting them to services and addressing some of the social determinants of health is really important. And so there's a tremendous amount we've learned about this patient population and their needs that I want to really talk about now. So here I have just a few some overarching principles, right? That it's incredibly important to be patient-centered and to use humanizing language. And I'll talk more about that. There is a real, I mean, we have to just name that racism exists, and it exists in our systems. And those who have been impacted by racism, they want to know that you see them as human. And that's incredibly important. I know it sounds very simple, but it's incredibly fundamental. And being culturally responsive. So this is where I think aligning oneself, if you yourself don't have those lived experiences, may not share those identities, it's important to align yourself with those who do, and name if you have differences. We don't kind of advocate for racelessness, right? If you happen to be a white physician giving care to someone who is a person of color, it's okay to name that. I actually think it buys you something, right? To be able to connect and say, hey, look, I don't have this lived experience. We also talk about it's important to be historically situated. So we think about the challenge of violence in this country, and that there is a criminal justice system. There's a justice system that has a role to play in this, and particularly law enforcement, that there's a tremendous amount of distrust between largely boys and men of color that our programs treat, and their relationship to law enforcement. And if this year has taught us nothing about that, is that is a deeply held issue, and that has been so for many generations. And so it's important to acknowledge that, and to not kind of imagine. One might imagine, if I were in this situation, I'd call the police, or I think about that actually our patients are dealing with a whole different set of circumstances, and that history really matters. We want to be trauma informed, right? And acknowledging not only the acute trauma, right, that there is in the moment, right, some sort of experience, but that we also acknowledge that also typically, right, our patients are coming in polyvictimization with there is largely adverse childhood experiences that young people come to us with, not just young and emerging adults. They come to with a whole host of experiences, and sometimes it's those earlier experiences that might be triggered, or it's a concern for loved ones, and not even kind of a focus on themselves that are actually in their experience what the trauma is or what the concern is. So really listening and not assuming, but holding space for trauma-informed care. I'll just continue talking about, we talk about in the clinical community, transference, right? This kind of, in some ways, projecting one's own relationships with others onto those who might be new. Well, the system, there's transference that happens with systems. And there are Native American psychologists who talk about this, that it may not be you as a representative of a health system or a hospital that this person has had a direct experience with, but you might come to symbolize all the failures that other systems have over a lifetime. And that's a lot, but it's just something to acknowledge that you may start the relationship with mistrust, and that doesn't mean it stays there, but acknowledging it allows us to not personalize when things get challenging immediately. You do your best, you want to come and build a relationship. It's absolutely possible to build a relationship, but it's going to take time and take patience. And also balancing personal agency with systems change, right? We acknowledge that there is such a thing as understanding behavior, and behavior change, of course, is meaningful. But if we don't understand this in the context of history and the context of the other determinants that impact health, that impact people's sense of their own opportunities, that all of those things come to bear, and that we have to attend to them as we understand the lives of our patients. So I'm going to kind of dive into some language pieces using some of these principles. So these are terms we really do hear from those that we work with, and we kind of lovingly invite them to kind of look or use a different view, right? So we've heard things like drug infested, or, and I appreciate you said this earlier, Megan, urban communities, right? As a proxy for a particular kind of experience. And we want to acknowledge that there are communities, and many communities, that are disproportionately impacted by violence or impacted by substance use. That allows us, if that's truly what you mean, then name that. If you're talking about communities of color, then say that. If you're talking about African Americans, then say that. But we don't want to use these proxies that actually don't acknowledge our rural communities that are also experiencing this. And actually what it does is it doesn't allow us to see the ways that the things we have in common, things that we can work on together. So that's incredibly important. We hear people refer to young people who may be involved or connected in some ways to groups as gangs, right? Thugs, gangbangers, or if you've been involved in the justice system, ex-convicts or convicts. And we really prefer language group involved. Some people use street affiliated, so you might hear that. I don't always advocate that as a term, but it is out there and feels more acceptable than gangs or gangbangers or formally incarcerated, right? So incarceration as a safer word than convict or conviction. And I just ran out of room, but justice involvement. Some people even prefer to leave off the criminal justice involvement, right? Like the justice system has all these different pieces of it. And so we don't want to emphasize the criminal part, but yes, if there's been justice involvement, to name it that. And even people who use violence, so being people first, that just provides human-centered understanding of the challenges. Another really important piece, it's a lot of nuance here, but this notion of an innocent victim. And this is a really big one. And we can spend a lot of time talking about this. So our patients are typically presumed to be involved in the violence that they receive. So they're coming to the hospital, they've been injured by firearm, or they've been stabbed, there have been other, so there's a presumption that they're involved, and the way in which they've experienced their care is that there's a perception that they are undeserving of care, right? They're undeserving of the designation victim. And even though the term victim, we might say survivor, there are some other words that I think are also very humanizing. In the justice system, there's kind of this idea that there's a perpetrator and a victim, and nary the two shall meet. And that is just, doesn't really reflect the full experience of those who might have used violence in the past, who may be also system involved, right? Justice system involved, but at the moment that they are seeking care, they are a victim and are worthy of care. And that any victim who comes to us is worthy of care. And finally, we hear these tropes about Black on Black crime, and they're leveraged to kind of talk about concerns that we see in the disproportionate impact of those in communities of color, that violence plagues those communities. But it's important for us to recognize violence is indeed a public health emergency. One of the strongest predictors of violence is exposure, and that those who are disproportionately impacted, we don't want to, we don't want to shy away from naming the disproportionate impact. But I think it's important to name that it's a health emergency for that reason, right? And to kind of center a solution in our way of describing it, so we tee up a response that therefore gives care and is addressing it, again, in a humanizing way. So I'm going to, thank you. I have I shared a little bit about my information. I'll stop sharing here, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Oh my goodness. Thank you all. And we knew this was going to happen. We could talk for like another hour, and I recognize we are not going to get through all the topics that we want, but I really hope this is the beginning of a conversation. And thank you for each, really getting to what we were hoping to, some of the very specifics. Rob, the reason we named this gun violence and firearm injury prevention is like, even those terms, what do we use and how do we tackle these things really matters. So we are going to put a recording up for people. We are looking at all the questions coming into the Q&A box. And we have a couple key ones we want to get to though. So I'm going to start off with Rob. You kind of touched on this, and then it came up there's a question in the chat box as well. Safety counseling and what that means when clinicians want to work with patients to help them be safer, and might talk about things like firearm safety counseling, which I think firearm safety probably has a different meaning. So what should we be calling it? And can you explain the nuance there of how you interpret firearm safety?
Yeah, I think the problem is that, again, safety has been sort of co-opted or almost weaponized against the gun community in the eyes of many people who are in the gun community. And whether we think that's fair or not doesn't really matter, right? For my time in law enforcement, I can definitely identify some of the things that I've said and I've been involved in, not even specifically in law enforcement, from Fatimah's presentation, where, yeah, I've said that. Like I've said those things that are apparently not appropriate ways of saying it. Now, in a closed room, I can say it to somebody in law enforcement and they're going to know exactly what I mean. I'm not going to offend anybody. I go in that other room, and if I say that and I potentially offend somebody and I can't be the good influence I want to be or have the good positive impact I want to have, I need to change what I'm saying. And I think so for a physician that wants to talk about responsible firearms ownership, that's great. And I don't think that's going to be heard the same way from the gun owner that is into the rights movement and into potentially wanting to resist any oppression or control over how they exercise their rights. Talking about responsibility instead of safety is probably going to get you further. I think it's really important too, not to try to dive too deep into that unless you are well-versed in responsible firearms ownership and practices. So if you were to say to someone, I have a lot of friends who are in the medical community, and I talk to my patients, it's on the list. It's on the list of things we talk about. And as long as it's on a list, great, right? And I caution gun owners as well, right? If the physician is asking you, your pediatrician is asking you about animals, asking you about a fireplace, asking you about a pool, asking you about balconies, asking you about firearms in the house, it's great. If the only thing they're asking you about is firearms, and I'm not asking you anything, is that true? Did they really not bring up any other aspects of your child's environment, or was firearms part of a list? Great, it's part of the list. It's one of the things that could incredibly negatively impact your family if it's not being stored responsibly, if you're not thinking about it. So I think that's within the realm, and a lot of gun owners bristle at the idea that it's even brought up. So bring it up as responsibility, and really just encouraging access control, right? Not, is it locked up? Is it in a safe? Do you control access to it, right? I think it's a much more neutral way to say it. Now, we may not agree that the way they are controlling access is the best way, but the idea is to encourage someone to think about it and encourage them to go home and do the right thing, because the doctor, it isn't seen as an authority on responsible gun use or gun rights, isn't going to have any more impact because they say, is it locked up? And I think you're going to encourage, access control as opposed to, is it locked up? Is a better way to approach that. So that we could, again, talk just about that probably for an hour.
I feel like we could talk about each of these questions for a whole nother hour. So I'm going to kind of, Rob, echo off of that in terms of a next question, which I saw multiple times throughout the questions, and which was also something that I know that we had talked about in prepping for this, which was really, and I think Ed Gardner is the most recent one to have put it in, but kind of this question of how do we break the conversation down? How do we start this conversation? And I'd love from all three of your perspectives. I'm just going to say, I know we're going to run out of time, but another topic that we all had talked about was this idea of lived experience and how you bring that in, which I think relates very much into this question of how do you start the conversation. So I'm going to actually start this one with Jill, but I'm going to ask all three of you to briefly, given that we have about 7 minutes left, to very briefly address this of if you could, to have someone start the conversation about firearm access or ownership with someone who is at risk within each of your areas, how would you encourage a provider or a community member to start that conversation? Oh, Jill, you are on mute. So it's COVID times,
That's the most popular phrase right now. You're on mute. I'm used to answering that question in relation to how do you start a conversation about suicide? But when you're talking about suicide and guns at the same time, I think you start with the issue about how the person is feeling. You want to have a compassionate, non-judgmental, connecting conversation. So I think you start with, how are you doing? And then you establish if there's something to be concerned about, you open the door to have that conversation. And so any conversation about guns is probably down the road a little bit, but first connecting with the person. And that's just starts with, I noticed you have been irritable lately. How are you doing? I'm worried about you. I care about you. And if you get to the point of someone saying, yes, I'm just had it, I'm just thinking of taking my life, then over the course of a conversation, then you want to find out how they're thinking of doing that. And then say, by the way, do you have whatever the means are or any other lethal means available to you? And then you just talk about how about putting that somewhere else. So for right now, you don't have access to it. So it's all in a discussion about getting through the suicidal crisis alive.
Thank you, Jill. That is a perfect, and again, we can delve more deeply into this in future webinars. Thank you. Fatimah and then Rob.
Sure. I'm going to echo a lot of what Jill said. You have to build a relationship, and but I think a particular place tactically, how do you begin? Our patients have come in with an injury, so there is something to focus on. There's and so sometimes it's starting with kind of wound care. I also think talking about family, either if they have children or have family members, if there's kind of a general discussion and then some sort of question, there patients I've served who've, they've come to me and said, their mother's really worried about them, or they have a lot of, are there things that you worry about, as a way to kind of very open-ended, right? And allow them to talk about some of the concerns they may have. And if safety does arise, right, their own safety does arise, I think that it opens conversation. Well, there are community organizations, or there are ways that we can help give some support, offer some support, right? I think I saw a question there about what happens when there aren't those support services. And I think that is a huge concern. But opening the conversation and recognizing that safety is on the minds of a lot of young people. And again, adults, emerging adults, it is incredibly important. That vulnerability, that disclosure is a really important piece. And talking through how do they handle those safety concerns, right? Because again, law enforcement, while that might be natural for us, may not be natural for them as a place to go, or nor safe for them to go. So.
Thank you. And Rob, last word almost. After you, I'll turn it back to Emmy.
So I think it's important to understand that look at the numbers of why people own guns and the motivations for people to own guns, and acknowledging those. And again, this has to be whether you think it's okay or not. When we do the cultural competency thing inside of the mental health community, well, the light bulb went off in my head when I understood that there was such a thing as cultural competency for mental health practitioners and therapists working with people in, let's say, the gay and lesbian community. They're not gay, they're not lesbian, but they want to be able to empathize or identify and be able to help those people because they're human beings. I think you need to think about the gun community in the same way. This may not be your lifestyle. It may not be something you engage in, but you have to respect the reality of it and the perspective the gun owner has. So if you sort of start from the default of the person you're talking to that you want to help prevent from being a part of a negative outcome or being involved in a negative outcome for their family, assume they're carrying the gun, right? If you think they're carrying a gun or you think they're a gun owner, assume they carry it for defense, assume they stage it in their home for defense, whether it's behind, inside of a quick access safe or behind a door or sitting on a kitchen table. If you make the assumption that that's okay, because it is for millions of people in America, if you can get to where that's okay, then you can start there and say, so you're a gun owner and you have a concealed carry permit if that's something in your state. You carry your gun regularly. How often do you carry your gun? Right? You're already making it okay for the gun to be accessible, and then get into access control. Well, you have with the kids, like, so the kids have access to the safe, or what do you do when you're not wearing the gun? When you get home, where does the gun go? You can start asking questions from a position of empathy, and even if it's, again, perceived empathy, an acknowledgement of legitimacy of that practice and the lifestyle where the gun is very readily accessible. It's loaded because the perception is you want to be prepared to control your environment and defend yourself from an outside threat. And I'm here to acknowledge, yes, the gun presents a potential for tragedy inside of the home, But the reason it's there is to prevent these other perceived tragedies. And that balance of risk and benefit is what we have to be talking about, not whether that's legitimate or not.
Jill, well, I do want to just acknowledge, I think we're at the top of the hour. I'll be on for another minute. I know people probably got to run. I so appreciate you all joining today. And I think this is probably the beginning of a conversation that we need to continue. And I hope we can. Maybe we'll have a follow-up. We'll see kind of if audience members want to send in thoughts, what you'd like to see next. We're happy to do what we can to try to keep these conversations going, because I think this is how we move forward, is we figure out how to actually talk to each other, how to have these conversations, how to ask these questions, because we all, at the end of the day, care about really the same thing in health and preventing preventable injuries and deaths. Jill, did you want to throw something in?
That's okay.
Okay. All right.
Up.
Thank you again. We will be posting the recording to this. If you're interested in getting in touch with anyone, you can contact me or Lucia Turpak, who may have been on the Zoom invitation. Thank you again to all of our attendees, and be well and be safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.